I asked her what was her first activity that she organised, and she explained that she'd just gone to school and was a 6-year-old going to school, and there wasn't there were a whole lot of kids in the local neighbourhood who hadn't gone to school and were very jealous and really wanted school. So she decided to set one up in her street, and she seemed to have run parent interviews as well. So she'll hopefully tell us a little bit more about that. Would you please welcome Ingrid Burkett?
Kia ora. Yes, that was probably one of my most failed enterprises, particularly when I started doing the parent-teacher interviews and telling the parents that their 2-year-olds hadn't been handing in their homework. But there was lots of learning, and the learning continues as my 2 younger sisters keep reminding me about that experience. Thank you so much for inviting me back. I had an absolute ball at the last conference last year and found it really inspiring, and went back full of energy, having come out of a very difficult period, and the sort of things that we talked about last year re-energised me, and I really valued that. So thank you, Di and Pat and Lindsay, for inviting me back. I've got a really difficult task now. Right, thank you. Thank you. I've got the difficult task because I've got the graveyard shift, and I'm keeping you all from drinks at the bar, so I'm very aware of that, and I also know that it's a very difficult topic in the graveyard shift to start talking about finance. So this is my yawn inducer, and I'd like you to have a big yawn now to get the oxygen flowing into the brains. And hopefully I won't see too many other yawns during the session. I'll be looking out. I'll be trying to convey my passion for the topic because, believe it or not, I am passionate about finance for social enterprises, and I think it's one of the key things that we need to figure out if we're actually going to make the sector work. I'll be talking about a piece of work that I did with my previous employer, who was Forrester's Community Finance. So you'll hear me throughout the session talking about we. So I'll be talking about we did this and we did that. That's Forrester's Community Finance. I'm no longer working with Forrester's, but I'm working alongside Forrester's doing some various other things, and I'm setting up a new social business at the moment. So that's the context of what I'll be doing. I think context is really important, and when we first started working in this space, we were very mindful of the sorts of things that were going on overseas, and we were very inspired by things that were happening in the UK particularly, but also in the US and in Canada. And we actually did a couple of study tours, which we organised ourselves, to get a real picture of what was happening internationally around this space. We found that really important, but what we also found really important was when we got back to realise that we were in a completely different environment, and the sorts of things that we saw over there were not necessarily applicable to our own context. So the context of this piece of research was trying to retrofit our own context into some of the exciting things that we saw overseas. We have a very different regulatory environment in Australia. Our policy environment, when we first started this work, we didn't really have a policy environment that was aligned with social enterprise or the social economy. That's shifting now. But it was we had to be part of that conversation. So a lot of the research that we did as an organisation was about trying to help to shape that policy environment. The nature of social enterprises was also very different, and the sort of scale that we were looking at was quite distinct. We were having conversations with our banks and major financial institutions, and that was an important part of our journey. But as I'll say a little bit later on, I don't think just engaging with the banks is the answer, in our context at least. And we had to develop the capacity to move beyond experimentation into really changing the structures. And that's what we hoped to learn through doing the research. I'm talking from an Australian context, and as of last year I can say as an Australian. So I've put New Zealand up the top there because I actually think it's a different context again. It was really inspiring this morning to go and listen to Sue Cooper from Prometheus and to hear more about, I was fascinated by Prometheus last year, to hear more about the sort of developments that are happening here, which is really exciting. And I'd love to continue the Trans-Tasman conversations around this area because we have lots to learn from each other. In the Australian context, social enterprises have depended very heavily on grant funding and philanthropy. And this has been interesting. I think it's going to be problematic in the long term. It was exacerbated by the financial crisis and the decision of our federal government to offer jobs funding into the social enterprise space. And what we saw happen was a whole lot of social enterprises pop up in response to the grant funding that have no way of being financially viable or sustainable beyond the grant funding. And we can say, oh, that's a terrible thing, associated with that grant funding. I think it will have long and lasting impacts on the development of the sector as a whole. So I think that's, putting that up as a cultural issue for the sector to deal with is important. As I said, we looked very much to the UK for models, and we really had to learn what was applicable and what wasn't. We've got a new and changing environment all the time. So the federal government has recently announced the Social Enterprise Development Investment Fund, which they've put out to tender and which will be announced in the next few months, which is a $20 million fund that will go to fund managers to invest in social enterprise. And we're talking about real investment where we have financial returns to investors as well as social returns. So that will have another huge impact on the sector in Australia. When we first started talking with social enterprises about finance, we often got this sort of response. What are you talking about finance for? It's not about the money, it's about the impact. I totally agree. But when it comes down to it, the sorts of things that we were talking to social enterprise managers about was, sorry, we can't mow the lawn today because our ute just broke down and we can't afford to buy a new one. We just need a bit of a loan to get us over this period because we've got a lumpy cash flow. It's not coming in, but we know it's there. If only we had better equipment, we could get so much more done. So all the conversations we were having were about money. We also started getting a lot of phone calls saying the banks won't lend to us. Would you lend to us? And Foresters Community Finance has a long history in Australia of lending to the not-for-profit sector. We had done some lending into the micro enterprise centre, and if you promise not to tell anybody outside this room, I can say that we were spectacularly unsuccessful in that space, and we had the very embarrassing default rate of 100%. So we had finished doing that for obvious reasons. But we learnt a lot. A few people this morning talked about learning from failures. We learnt more than we have learnt in any other venture through that work. And what we learnt was finance is not enough. If you don't have the support around the finance, you can finance as much as you like, but you're going to have issues. We were still getting a lot of comments, and this is a quote from the research. When it comes to non-profits and things like loans, it's not something banks are generally very good at. So I think part of it is having someone who really gets what you do. Our bank manager is lovely, but I don't think she really gets what we do. She doesn't really understand our needs and how they differ from more traditional banking relationships. We had done some fairly extensive work about financial exclusion in Australia, and a lot of financial exclusion work is focused on the financial exclusion of individuals and households. What we found in that work was that social enterprises were actually excluded as well, and so were not-for-profit organisations. And so as an organisation, that's something that we wanted to address. Over the course of this research, we heard some really horrific stories about things that social enterprises were forced to do because they couldn't get access to basic capital. So I think the most horrific story for me was an enterprise that actually is very successful. They turned up to their local bank and asked for a loan to buy a new vehicle. They were knocked back by multiple banks because they were a not-for-profit organisation, and as I'll talk about a bit later, their financial statements were unusual. So it was very difficult. I'm not bank blaming here because it actually, when I looked at their financial statements, I would not have lent to them either. So they went to a low doc finance company and they got a loan for $40,000. It was a truck ute. And the interest rate on that was 38% per annum. When I looked at the contract for that loan and looked at the conditions in that contract, I wept because I could not see how even a successful social enterprise could afford to pay back that sort of loan with those conditions. It was very, very difficult. So we saw from a lot of that work that there was multiple kinds of financial exclusion. And as we started interviewing people, we saw that there was problems getting asset capital, there was problems getting working capital. So another example of a social enterprise was also a very successful social enterprise who couldn't get access to working capital. And they paid a broker to get the sort of working capital that would make shivers run up and down my spine. And they had paid a considerable amount of money to get that from a non-mainstream finance company. We also found that people had difficulty getting growth capital. They not just had difficulty getting access to capital, though, they also had trouble getting low-cost banking, because we, unlike the UK, don't have legal structures that differentiate ourselves other than for-profit and not-for-profit. And if you're a social enterprise and you're using a for-profit legal structure, you can get access to certain kinds of banking and financial services and products, but not necessarily the grant capital that you may need, and vice versa. So we were finding a lot of social enterprises who couldn't get access to basic things like low-cost banking. So what did we do? We decided to engage in an action research process, and that was about developing a deeper understanding of the financial realities and needs of social enterprises. Foresters does not do philanthropic lending. The corpus of capital that Foresters lends from is from private investors. So we were not going to repeat our experiment of the micro enterprises, which I have to say did not lose any private capital. We did that with gift capital, but we weren't going to go ahead for a 100% default rate ever again. We had learnt our lessons. So we needed to actually understand the marketplace really, really well to know what it was that we were going to invest in, so we did not lose a cent of private investors' money. And what we wanted to do was to develop appropriate, fair and accessible products and services that acknowledge the particular realities and needs of social enterprises. So we started with a series of questions, and we thought, okay, what we need is a bit of naivety in this research. We have to start with very, very basic questions, like what are social enterprises? And there's lots of definitions out there. In fact, if I go to another conference that tries to define social enterprises, I think I'll pull the rest of my hair out. But we wanted to actually be really clear. If we were going to use private investment capital to invest in social enterprises, we needed to be able to tell our investors what we were going to invest in and what we were not going to invest in. So we needed to know what they were. We needed to know, well, do they actually need capital beyond grant capital? At what stage of their life cycle do they need capital, and what kinds of capital do they need at those different stages? What kinds of capital, where could we source it? And how much will it cost that we will have to pass on to the social enterprises? And the most important thing is what was needed to make it work, because I think someone, Connell, I think, mentioned this morning about living in the jungle. We knew that it was a jungle out there, but we were the sort of species that wanted to know how to survive in the jungle no matter what. And we were absolutely convinced that we could make something work. We just needed to know how to manipulate things in order to create something that worked for social enterprises, worked for investors, and made the impact real. We also wanted to focus not just on the social enterprises, but on both the demand and supply side of the equation. So on the demand side, we wanted to know what the needs and demands and the realities of social enterprises were, and what their capacity was to deal with things like debt or things like equity. On the supply side, we wanted to also know who was out there, who was going to either lend or invest into social enterprises, what kind of products were out there, and that services that could be available to social enterprises. So as I said, there's lots of definitions. This is an increasingly popular one in Australia, developed by Jo Burkett and her team at QUT. And it's a very broad brush definition. So under this definition, which came out of the Finding Australia's Social Enterprises research project, Jo suggested that there might be as many as 20,000 social enterprises in Australia. Now that included local sports clubs who could meet these criteria, as well as large mutual organisations. So there's a huge differential. Now, if we adopted a definition like this in this research, we could be opening ourselves up for a huge number of knocks on the door. We needed a more fine-grained definition. And I think that's where the definitional debate needs to head. It needs to move out of the general, how do we define social enterprises, into the specific. If we're lending to social enterprises, what does it actually mean? If we're procuring from social enterprises, who are we procuring from? And when we get down to high stakes, like investment or procurement, those are the sort of fine, detailed definitions that we needed. In fact, one of the criticisms of the research was that there was too much definitional stuff. So if you want to see the detail of the fine grain that we got to, I'm happy to send you the report. But the three key distinctions that we needed to make were the differences between enterprising third sector organisations, which were not-for-profit organisations that had done some enterprising things, or that had an enterprising trading arm, that sort of thing. Social enterprises, which was our key interest, and social business, which they have a much more commercial mindset. A lot of them have no grants at all. In fact, some of them have put into their constitutions that they will never have a grant in their life because they don't want to get into that cycle. And in the main, they're actually able to access normal commercial finance and capital. The enterprising third sector organisation is an interesting distinction, I think, Because Foresters has been in the business of lending to not-for-profit organisations for about 15 years. And what we'd learnt from that work was that if you invest in the assets of a not-for-profit organisation and, for example, help them to purchase their premises, then and we lent particularly to small to medium-sized community organisations, then one of the outcomes of that, of asset building, is that those organisations not only have to be enterprising to get the loan in the first place, but they actually leverage off that loan and off that asset and become super enterprising. So a lot of the organisations that we had lent to over the 15 years actually had developed social enterprises that came off the back of those assets. It's not a one-size-fits-all environment. So we needed to know about social enterprises. We wanted to focus on small to medium-sized social enterprises. In the research, we focused on enterprises that were between 1 and 12 years in operation and had a range of impact areas. So we didn't just look at employment-related social enterprises. We had food-related social enterprises, recycling enterprises, and, of course, employment. When we started looking at the business literature out there about the life cycles of enterprises, what we saw is this sort of thing. So there was a very linear flow. So people started off with a concept, they had a start-up period, they had a take-off, and then they grew into a stable and expanding enterprise. Or another one, the revenue seemed to go up. Now, this confused us when we looked at the enterprises that we were working with, because none of them actually had a curve that went anything like that. In fact, our curve was like this. And actually, there was a few that had backward curves within that process as well. As you can see here, there's actually a long period before the startup phase. So before anything actually begins, there's all the planning and preparation and those sort of things. We knew that that was a really, really difficult space for a lot of social enterprises. What we also knew, though, was that we couldn't really play a role in that space. So we couldn't lend to people who had a great idea. And in fact, it was really dangerous to lend to people who had a great idea. There was a lot of grants that were focused around that period. I also think that's really dangerous. I'd be interested, to talk to people who have alternative views, but I'm increasingly of the view that that's quite a dangerous space to grant into if people don't have what's called in the business world skin in the game. So I actually think, of all the enterprises that we looked at, the ones who developed sweat equity, who really, really struggled, who put, doubled up mortgages onto their house, who lent money from their friends and family, who really, really wanted to get this off the ground and had the passion and made that thing happen no matter what, were the ones who got to the startup phase where they were actually beginning to be investable in the broad sense of the term. What we knew, though, is that different capital was appropriate for each of these different phases. So we didn't want to just focus on debt. We wanted to actually expand the notion of capital throughout the whole range. So we wanted to focus on grant capital, debt capital, and equity capital. And we wanted to make sure that we focused on right capital, because that's really important. As I said before, we have had an addiction in the Australian context to grant capital. We're starting to talk much more about debt capital, and things like the federal government process will talk about that sort of thing. What we haven't talked about and what wasn't mentioned by a whole lot of the enterprises is equity capital. And that's because a lot of social enterprises aren't actually set up in order to cope with equity. We don't have the nice legal structures in the Australian context that enable people to have equity in their context without a lot of rigmarole. Also, the social enterprises had no idea what equity was about or what it could do. Where we've got to in the Australian context is starting to talk about something called debt-quity, where we actually use debt structures but to do the sorts of things that we could do with equity. I'd love to explore the equity and shares model in the Australian context much more, and just got inspired by Hugh Rollo's workshop on community shares, but it's another piece of research. The challenges were both on the supply and the demand side, and oftentimes we talk about the need for capacity building for social enterprises. I actually think there's a need for capacity building for financial institutions as well. So the sorts of risk assessments that financial institutions have, the sort of regulatory structure that we have in financial institutions, and the culture, the thing about not-for-profits walking through the door and the conversation stops there. Those sort of things need to be addressed if mainstream financial institutions are going to move into this space. And that's a capacity building task, I think. That's not to let the social enterprises off the hook though, because as I said, there are some structural issues. And now, in setting up social enterprises, I'm very careful about what kind of structure people take on because it influences what kind of capital is going to be available and what we can then do in that social enterprise. Financial management and governance is often the thing that's focused on the most in capacity building. I think there are lots of issues around that, but I actually don't think it's the major issue that we need to focus on, except when it comes to financial records and financial statements. So we found some very amazing things when we looked at the detail of what people had in their financial statements. We had one organisation who actually technically was trading insolvent, except that they had listed on their balance sheet sweat equity, and they had valued that on their balance sheet, which they had been advised to do by an accountant who didn't understand social enterprise. But it was a very interesting scenario. So when we looked at the financial records, there was most of the enterprises that we looked at we would not lend to without some very serious conversations. Most of the enterprises, it was very difficult to tell what was grant income and what was earned income. So you can't use grant income, for example, to repay a loan in the main. So you have to be able to tell the difference between grant and earned income. If you can't do that, there is a reason for not getting past some of those bank managers. We also looked at the risk and the viability and the investment readiness of a lot of organisations. And those are the areas that I think in capacity building terms that we need to focus on. What we learnt through the research is that if we look at social enterprises, charity and welfare mindsets don't work. We need investment mindsets. We also learnt that business and commercial mindsets don't work. We need a deep understanding of the organisations, their purpose, and what this actually means for investing in them. This is a high-touch, a relational process. It's not a standard commercial proposition. So what we learnt was there is a need for organisations like Prometheus and Foresters Community Finance who can act as intermediaries between the financial world and the social enterprises. The other really big learning that has big impacts for social enterprises and the way that they run their books is the difference between operating and production costs and impact costs. And this is where we made some big findings around what is appropriate capital for what part of a social enterprise. So what we learned through the research was that these things actually need to be clearly articulated in financial statements. If social enterprises are going to attract investment, then an investor needs to be able to tell by looking at the records what is an impact cost and what is an operational cost. What we also learnt was that there is no use in putting grant money, grant capital, into the operational and production end of a social enterprise. If you do that, you're actually supporting an unviable social enterprise. Equally, if you put debt capital into the the impact part of a social enterprise, there's no point in doing that because people are not going to be able to repay from the impact side. So we learnt about how to link capital appropriately to different parts of a social enterprise. We also learnt about some of the vicious cycles that social enterprises get into. So there was one story in particular that illustrates this, starting off with a lack of poor quality equipment. This was a restaurant, a cafe that was set up by some refugees in Brisbane. They were running a commercial cafe and they had a 2-burner stove. So if they had any more than a dozen people in the cafe at any one time, you'd have to wait for about an hour to get your meals. So that reduced the capacity to carry out the work or any capacity to scale up, which reduced their potential income, which meant they had no surplus to invest to get a 4-burner stove or a commercial type of stove. They also couldn't lend for that purpose. So they were in a really vicious circle of not being able to grow the business, which meant that they couldn't provide the impact that they were set up to provide because they had to keep putting off staff on a Saturday night because there just wasn't enough customer base. Again, we learnt about what we call the sandwich of investment, that if we're going to direct grant capital appropriately, where we should be directing it is into the support, participation and impact costs. That's very appropriate for grant capital. We can use philanthropic capital particularly and gifts in the infrastructure and development costs. For example, in that restaurant, it would have been a really good opportunity for a philanthropic body to be able to provide the infrastructure that would not hide the core operating costs, but would actually break that vicious cycle. And then debt capital should be focused on the core operating costs and making sure that the organisation can actually operate as a real business, and that's where it would traditionally be used in a business sense. We looked at, just finally, the viability and sustainability. So we saw these two things as very, very different things. So for viability, for a viable social enterprise, enterprises need reliable income. So they need contracts, for example. We found the enterprises who had contracts actually were the more successful enterprises because they had a regularity of work. They didn't have such lumpy cash flows, and they didn't have the seasonal issues of if you have to go out and sell your services and you get a very lumpy, individually, you get a very lumpy cash flow. They needed regular and loyal customers and repeat business. And that's where, the smoothing of the cash flow needed to happen. That was a very different proposition to the sustainability. So the sustainability of social enterprises was not about the profit and loss statement, it was about the balance sheet. And it was about building the assets, the equity, and managing the liabilities of those enterprises. That's a very full of technical jargon at this hour of the afternoon. But what we were really interested in was how can we shape those things so that we really focus on the impact and the blended returns. Our investors were interested in getting financial returns from their investment, but they were also interested in knowing what the social returns were. Going back to our experience then, what we learnt was the importance of developing an ecology of finance. So it wasn't just about accessing the capital, but it was about trying to put the right infrastructure and ecology around enterprises so they could actually hold the capital and use it to build sustainability. The bigger picture learnings that we had and that have evolved since the research. So we launched the research last year in April, and we've had a lot of learning since then. So what we found was that once we got policy take-up, it became a lot easier. So it's really hard to develop finance models for social enterprise in a policy and funding vacuum. We're learning that government support is actually critical for innovation, but that applied research like that can actually start to catalyse and influence the policy debates that are held. So it's really important part of it. And we need the full range of financial products from the mainstream to the alternative to get a good ecology. The next 10 years in the Australian context will see a very, very different picture. We're starting to have those debates about scale. I slightly disagree with Steve Lawrence, although I don't know that I'd say that openly other than here, because I actually think in the social enterprise space, like the traditional business space, we need to think about small to medium enterprises. I think it's quite interesting that in the not-for-profit space and in the social enterprise space, we talk about larger scale organisations. If you said in a business forum that you wanted to challenge SMEs, small to medium enterprises, there would be shock and horror because SMEs are actually the main backbone of the economy. And so I think we need to have that discussion about, what can small to medium social enterprises offer in this space? We are going to see much more diverse models of social enterprise and a greater scale. And we're going to see through the CED, the Social Enterprise Development Investment Fund, a maturity of the social investment space. And I think an increased appetite for people to move into social enterprise. So we're only just having the discussions about foundations and philanthropists moving into this space. But the next conversation, I think, is how do those bodies invest their corpus of funds into social enterprises, not just their philanthropic funds. If you'd like a copy of the paper, it's available from there, or you can email me. Thank you. I'm just going to jump in and actually do the introduction thing as I go, because I just want to give people a really quick overview of social procurement before I tell you what the history of how did I get involved in social procurement and what's that story about. So the way I see it is that really it's about bringing social impact right into the core of businesses and asking how can we generate social impact from the way that governments, corporations and not-for-profit organisations spend their money. So I'm interested in not just leaving the social impact in the corporate social responsibility part of organisations or leaving it with the social policy workers or the community development team, but bringing it right into parts of organisations that don't usually get exposed to social impact. How did it all start? Although I've been involved in various research, I actually don't subscribe to the idea that we should just do research without having a reason to do research. So that's why I don't work in a university and I'm not an academic. I do action research. And that's what my new role is all about, to help people to design knowledge and action research and actually find out how things that we want to change in the world can actually work. So about 10 years ago, I was working with a bunch of social enterprises around Brisbane, and we found what was happening was that a lot of intermediary organisations were coming in. They hadn't had any social enterprise experience themselves, but they were keen to work into the space of social enterprise. So they're coming in and interviewing us all about what is social enterprise and what do you do and how can we do it, and then running away and typing all of that up, and then they were the ones who won the contracts to consult to social enterprises. And we thought about that for a while and thought, there's something wrong in this equation, because we were all cash strapped. We had cash flow issues. We were the ones with providing the knowledge. So we formed an informal network called New Mutualism, and we decided to generate our own knowledge and to use that to earn income. So we produced a couple of little booklets, one about what is social enterprise, and the next one was about social tendering, what we called social tendering. And where that came from was that we had realised, being in the social enterprise space, that social enterprises with contracts were doing a lot better. And so we started a conversation with the Brisbane City Council to say, well, what if you gave us a percentage of your contracts as social enterprises? And they were absolutely horrified, and we know now why they were horrified, because they don't give away contracts at local government or any level of government. You actually have to competitively tender for those contracts. But we decided to document the process of the conversation with them, and that's how this book ended up being around. So what happened then was that we got Cheryl Curnow to write the foreword to that, and at that time she was just out of politics, so she was a federal politician who had moved out of politics, and she went over to the UK and worked at Oxford for a few years, and we got her to write the foreword. When she came back to Australia, she worked for the Centre for Social Impact, and she commissioned us to look more deeply into the whole idea of what it means in a broader context. What if organisations started purchasing from social enterprises? So we did two things. My mouth is going to dry up, thank you. We did two things. The Victorian state government, because we have three levels of government, it's all very, very complex. The Victorian state government actually is responsible for local governments, and there was this wonderful entrepreneur in the Victorian state government who decided that it would be really helpful if local governments would be able to access a resource that could tell them how to do social procurement. He wanted something that was very, very practical and that would address the legal issues, because oftentimes the first barrier that's put up, and that's where the conversation stops, is we can't do social procurement because it's illegal. Thank you. So we did that piece of work, and that piece of work involved going into local governments and unpacking what the process was of procurement. So talking to procurement officers, talking to anybody who was associated with purchasing, and documenting what their practice was and how we could build in social impacts into that. and then talking to the social enterprises who they were contracting with and seeing what the barriers were and trying to join the two together. So what we tried to come up with was a very, very practical and a broad-ranging guidelines for social procurement. We also got the Solicitor General to provide us with legal advice and guidelines, which was a real blessing because that cut out all the discussions about that it's illegal, and they actually gave us a very good framework. And we would recommend that to anybody to get the legal advice and the guidelines for wherever you are, because that'll save a lot of conversations. We then took that into a national level, and so we looked at how to build social impact into purchasing across all levels of government, corporates and larger not-for-profits. Interestingly, a lot of corporates and governments were saying to us, you know, what we need is models of this sort of thing, and what we would like is for the not-for-profit sector to demonstrate that this actually works. So we would like to know who the large not-for-profits are actually purchasing from, and are they purchasing from social enterprises, and could they give us, you know, test of concept to say that this actually works. And then we went to the not-for-profits and said, well, who are you purchasing from? And what we found was that although a lot of them were advocating social procurement, they weren't actually practicing it themselves. So that was a really good lesson for us about, you know, how to create a change in the sector. I think the other big lesson for us was that when we went in and talked to procurement officers, they were like, oh my God, not another thing that we're going to have to add into our procurement processes. We're just trying to deal with strategic procurement. We're just trying to deal with green procurement. The last thing in the world we need is something else to add to the agenda that looks like it's really complex. So, you know, following on from what Hugh said this morning, what we had to do was make it really, really simple. This is something that every council can do very easily. A lot of you are already doing it, but you just don't know that you're doing it. We're going to simplify the process. It's not something new. It's actually part of triple bottom line procurement. And everyone went, oh, is it? Because we've always wondered what the social part of triple bottom line procurement was all about. And now we know. So to link it in with something that people are already familiar with was a really important thing. I won't go through these practical examples in detail. I'll just give you two just as a bit of a taste test. What we tried to do was to say to councils, okay, everybody thinks that social procurement is about adding social clauses into contracts, and that is true. There are parts of social procurement that are about the contracting end, but it doesn't have to be about that pointy end of the continuum. We wanted to see it as a continuum, that there are simple things that people can do in all councils. So some councils are engaging with social procurement just by putting directories together of who the social enterprises are in their area, and promoting that within council to their staff, promoting it to their purchasing officers, but also promoting it more broadly in the community so that all consumers know where they can purchase products, goods and services that have a social impact. Then you get down to the other end of the continuum, which is about the contracting. So councils having large infrastructure projects and wanting some of the benefits, the economic and the social benefits, to flow back into their constituents. So they can add social clauses into their contract to make sure that the suppliers for that infrastructure project actually employ people, say, who've been unemployed for long periods of time, or to employ local people, or to generate some other kinds of social impacts. I won't go through all of these. I mean, basically, it's about the benefits for councils are about adding social value into purchasing, aligning the procurement practices with their social objectives, And all of these sort of arguments, I think, make it really what some people in Australia are calling a no-brainer. I mean, all councils are under pressure to do more with less, to strategically align all of their agendas. And if we have social objectives in our councils, it makes really good sense to align that with the economic agendas, and purchasing is a big part of that. So we're suggesting that it creates greater effectiveness, greater efficiencies, and more strategic resources. If we have a look at the benefits for local communities, I mean, for social enterprises, it is about building stability of income over time. And what we're seeing is the social enterprises who have contracts can grow their capacities over time, and that they actually are more successful over time because they don't have that really hard transaction cost of going out and finding individual clients along the way. So just to give you a quote from one of the social enterprises that I think really touches this, they said, "Well, thanks very much for the $10,000 grant, that's great, but really we're a business, and if we're going to be sustainable, then we're not going to do that with grants. What we'd really like is the chance to compete for your $1 million cleaning contract. That's what's going to make it possible to keep our people in work." And I mean, that's the essence of the argument, that these social enterprises are not wanting more and more top-up grants, they're actually wanting business, and that's what's going to reach the social impact. I don't think it's just about employment, and I think that's a really important thing to point out, that there's lots of ways to put social impact into the procurement and purchasing processes, and these are some of the social impacts that we looked at. So for some communities, particularly rural and regional communities, it can be about local sustainability of their community. If their local government, who's often the largest employer in town and the largest purchaser, is not purchasing from local businesses, then that doesn't make any economic sense. We can put local sustainability in there, we can look at fair trade, we can look at innovation. And I think the interesting thing that I found was that local government is actually, I think, the most innovative level of government. I mean, in Australia we're over-governed, we've got 3 levels of government, but the other 2 levels of government don't have the same opportunities to be really innovative. So we found heaps of examples of really innovative, practical ways that councils could engage with this agenda. I don't think it's rocket science, and it's, as I said, it's not all at the pointy end. What I just want to focus on is the 4 different ways that councils, I think, can engage with the agenda. They can focus on the contract side of things, so they can put clauses into their contracts and demand their suppliers supply social impacts as part of their contracts. But they can also step back and say, we want to have a policy approach to this. An example in the Australian context is that at federal government level, there's a policy that all contractors to federal government have to have equal opportunities for women employment policies. And if they don't, they can be blacklisted at federal government level and not ever win any more contracts. And they can also be named and shamed in Parliament. It's not a policy that has been very successful in actually employing more women, interestingly enough. And if you look at the whole of the social procurement area, the policy sounds the best way to go, but actually it's the hardest because there's a big leap to make between policy and implementation. And oftentimes there's not the teeth behind the policy to actually make things like employing more women a reality. We can also have a supplier focus. So I think this is an interesting area. Brisbane City Council, I think, has done some very interesting work in this space. They looked at social procurement a few years ago, and that's how we got to write that first little book. And they were very interested, but they realised that the social enterprises that they had around them actually didn't have the capacity to compete for any of their contracts. They were too little. They didn't have the savvy to be able to compete against the big suppliers. And even if they did win a contract, they couldn't actually deliver on the contract. So they put in place a process of actually building the capacity of those social enterprises over time and using contracting to build that capacity. So they enabled those enterprises to apply for small contracts in a non-competitive environment as a first step. Then they would test them out and they would work alongside them. So if they didn't have the lawn mowing equipment, they could borrow the council lawn mowing equipment. It was a very, very risky strategy for a council to go and do, but it had some really good successes. Then they set up a thing that they called social tendering eventually, where those social enterprises would start competing against each other. So they'd get a taste of the competitive environment, but they wouldn't be competing against the $1 million, multinational companies. They then looked for ways to help those enterprises to grow into the competitive market. So they had a pathway approach to social procurement. Why did they do that? Because, and I think this is an important part of this supplier focus, what's happening more and more for councils particularly is the supplier diversity is drying up. So the contracts are getting larger and larger and larger because it's more efficient to aggregate a whole lot of contracts and offer it as one big contract. But when you do that, you actually reduce the number of suppliers who can compete for those contracts. So, we're in a situation where, if you put out a catering contract in Australia, there's really only 3 suppliers, no matter where you are in Australia, who are going to compete for, a $10 million catering contract. So what the councils are realising is that over time, sorry?
You get euros?
No, but it might be this might be under another name. So over time, we're ending up with monopolies, which reduce the quality of what we're getting. Okay. So that's why they're doing it, because they want to increase their supplier diversity over time. And if we can do that in a way that links into social enterprises, that's great. The market development focus is a fairly complex thing, so I won't go into it, but if you're interested, I'm happy to follow it up later. The last thing I'll say is that I think the only way social procurement is going to work really is if it's not just about social enterprises. So listening to the last 2 speakers about Aboriginal enterprises and Maori enterprises is a really important part of this discussion as well. What we realised was that if we just focus it on social enterprises, what we're actually doing is cutting out all the other suppliers who could potentially deliver social impact benefits. So we came up with a new category called social benefit suppliers, which includes social enterprises, but it also includes Indigenous businesses, and it includes disability enterprises, and it can include not-for-profit organisations and minority-owned businesses as well. So, and the trick is to actually work out what it is that you want to deliver on a social level and then link that to the sorts of suppliers that are available. So I'll stop there and open up the conversations.
Thank you very much. Yes, stimulating. So, throw it open to you. What would you like to know or share?
Just what you finished on there, the trick is to know what you want to deliver and you find suppliers for. Can you just explain a little bit more?
I think the first part of the procurement process is asking what is it that we want to purchase. And if we want to purchase social impacts alongside goods and services, because social procurement is not about buying social services, it's about buying roads, for example, and linking in social impacts. We need to know what those social impacts are that we're going to purchase and build them into every stage of the procurement process. Does that make sense?
Can you give us some examples?
Okay, so for example, in Brisbane, one of the things that the council's very keen to do is engage with people who have been long-term unemployed. So they've got all their community development people who are engaging with, disability enterprises and engaging with trying to create economic development to engage people who are long-term unemployed. At the same time as they've got, a large park maintenance contracts out. So what they did was to try and link that emphasis on long-term unemployment with their parks and maintenance contracts. And they looked for the economic inefficiencies. So we actually had a large New Zealand company who won the contracts for all the parks across Brisbane. And they had, great, good on you. I'm very happy about that. But they had huge machinery because they had, hundreds and hundreds of parks, large parks to mow. So they had all this giant equipment, but they had some areas where they had tiny parks. So they would mow these tiny parks with this very large equipment and run over Mrs. Brown's roses, and Fred's vegetable patch might get a bit of chemical spray on it because they had to do it the same way that they did the large parks. And they'd get heaps of complaints from Mrs. Brown, who lost her roses, and Fred, who lost his veggies. And that was really inefficient for them because they'd have to respond. They were legally obligated to respond to every single complaint. So they decided to cut the small parks out of the large contract and offer them as a social tender to the social enterprises. And that way they've kept 5 or 6 social enterprises whose focus is addressing long-term unemployment.